We remember Eden as a garden, but the ancient text itself is also concerned with rivers, lands, directions, and the place of human beings within a larger world. That creates a quiet paradox. Perhaps what later generations pictured as paradise once carried a stronger sense of geography than memory preserved. If so, what was lost was not only a place, but an older map of human beginnings. So, what do the Dead Sea Scrolls actually preserve about Eden's geography, and why does it not fit the garden we imagine today? When people hear the word Eden, they often imagine a garden immediately. Trees heavy with fruit, clear water, gentle animals, and two human beings living inside a place untouched by suffering. That image has become so familiar that Eden and the Garden of Eden are often treated as if they were two names for the same thing. Yet the wording of Genesis is more careful than that memory suggests. The text describes God as planting a garden in Eden, toward the east, and placing the human there. That small distinction changes the landscape. A garden can exist within a larger territory, just as a field can exist within a valley or a settlement within a region. If we follow the wording closely, Eden may be the wider setting, while the garden is a particular place inside it. This does not tell us where Eden was, and it does not prove that Eden corresponded to any modern location. It simply asks us to notice what the text says before later imagination fills the scene for us. The distinction matters because the story soon introduces movement, water, direction, and boundaries. A river is said to flow from Eden to water the garden, and from there the water is associated with four named rivers. The narrative also refers to lands beyond the garden. Even before trying to identify any of those names, the structure suggests that the garden belongs to a broader geography. The human beginning described here is therefore placed inside a world with an inside and an outside, with areas that can be entered, left, watered, named, and remembered. For ancient communities, such distinctions were not merely decorative. Human life depended on knowing where water could be found, where land could support food, and how one place related to another. We should be cautious not to project a modern map onto the story, but we should be equally cautious about reducing its geography to scenery. The setting helps define where human life begins, what is available there, and what can later be lost. The garden is described as a place where the human receives food and responsibility. Eden, by contrast, appears to extend beyond that immediate living space. This becomes more important when the story turns toward departure. The narrative creates layers of space: the cultivated place where the human lives, Eden from which water flows, rivers extending toward named lands, and a world beyond the protected place. That layered geography does not allow us to recover a lost coordinate. It does something more basic. It places human origins inside a landscape that has structure. The first humans in the story are not presented in a timeless paradise disconnected from the earth. They are placed somewhere, given access to certain things, limited from others, and eventually moved beyond a boundary. This is why the familiar phrase Garden of Eden can quietly narrow our understanding if we stop listening to the wording behind it. Over centuries, art, preaching, poetry, and ordinary speech compressed the larger setting and the garden into one memorable picture. The compression is understandable because the garden is where the central human drama occurs. But when the two are separated again, Eden begins to look less like a single enclosed paradise and more like the name of a wider setting within which the garden had a particular place. We cannot go further than the evidence allows. The text does not provide enough information to say that Eden was a country, valley, plateau, or any specific terrain known today. Nor does the distinction prove that the author intended a modern geographic description. What it gives us is a careful starting point. The story of human beginnings opens with nested spaces, rather than one undivided paradise. Once that is noticed, the question changes. Instead of asking only where the garden was, we have to ask what kind of place Eden was supposed to be around it. Once Eden and the garden are no longer treated as exactly the same place, another feature of the Genesis account becomes easier to notice. The story repeatedly uses the language of location. It speaks of a garden planted in Eden, of an eastern direction, of a river flowing outward, of named lands, and of waterways connected with regions beyond the garden itself. None of these details gives us a modern map, but together they create something more structured than a simple background for a moral story. The human beginning is placed within a landscape that has direction, distance, boundaries, and connections. That matters because ancient geography was not necessarily organized in the same way that modern geography is. Today we expect maps to provide scale, coordinates, measurable distances, and rivers that can be traced precisely from source to sea. Ancient texts often worked differently. Places could be described according to journeys, neighboring peoples, rivers, mountains, sacred centers, or remembered regions. A location could carry physical meaning and cultural meaning at the same time. When Genesis names rivers and lands, it therefore invites geographic attention, but it does not promise the precision of a modern atlas. This distinction protects us from two opposite mistakes. One mistake is to treat every geographic detail as a coded set of coordinates waiting to be solved. The other is to dismiss every geographic detail as purely symbolic and therefore irrelevant to the physical world. The text itself gives us reasons to avoid both extremes. Two of the rivers later associated with Eden are names connected with the ancient Near Eastern world, while other names are much harder to identify with confidence. The mixture of familiarity and uncertainty suggests that the story reaches toward a known world without becoming a simple travel description. For listeners thinking about the origins of humanity, this is important. Human beginnings are not described in an empty space. They are imagined in relation to water, fertile ground, surrounding lands, and movement across boundaries. Water in particular would have been deeply connected with survival in the environments known to ancient communities. Rivers could support agriculture, animals, transport, settlement, and the continuity of human life across generations. Yet we should not assume that every river in the story was included merely because of practical survival. In ancient literature, water could also help define order, abundance, separation, and the relationship between a central place and the wider world. Genesis allows these meanings to stand beside one another without explaining them in modern categories. This is why the geography of Eden becomes more interesting when we resist the desire to identify it too quickly. The text begins to function less like a puzzle with one hidden answer, and more like an ancient description of a world organized around a meaningful center. The garden occupies one place within that arrangement. Water moves from Eden toward the garden and beyond. Lands exist outside it. Directions matter. Later, access will matter as well. In this sense, the geography is already preparing the larger human story. The movement from a protected place into a wider world is not only a change in moral condition, it is also a change in space. Human life begins in one kind of environment and continues in another. That pattern would become familiar throughout ancient traditions, where migration, exile, settlement, and return were often inseparable from identity. We do not need to claim that Genesis records a literal migration from a recoverable prehistoric location to recognize that the text understands human existence spatially. People belong somewhere, leave somewhere, remember somewhere, and organize their past around places that carry meaning. This may help explain why Eden remained so powerful in later Jewish interpretation. It was not simply a beautiful garden from a distant beginning. It was a place connected with questions about where humanity came from, what kind of world surrounded that beginning, and why the original place could no longer be entered in the same way. The geography does not solve those questions, but it gives them a shape, and that shape begins with a simple observation. The story of human origins is also a story about where human beings are placed in the world. The more carefully we read the geography of Eden, the more important it becomes to notice what the text does not give us. Genesis names a garden, a direction, a river, several lands, and 4 waterways, but it never supplies the kind of information required to identify a precise location on a modern map. There are no coordinates, no measured distances, no sequence of landmarks that could guide a traveler from one known point to another. The description feels geographic because it is organized around places and movement, yet it remains incomplete by modern standards. That incompleteness is not a flaw to be repaired by invention. It is part of the evidence itself. When later readers try to locate Eden by matching every name with a present-day river or region, they often move beyond what the surviving text can securely support. Some identifications are more plausible than others, but plausibility is not the same as certainty. The names Tigris and Euphrates connect the story with a recognizable ancient landscape, while Pishon, Gihon, Havilah, and Cush create difficulties that have never been resolved in a way accepted by everyone. The problem becomes even greater when the river system is treated as a literal map. The arrangement described in Genesis does not fit easily with the courses of rivers as we know them today. That does not prove the geography is fictional, and it does not prove that a lost landscape once matched the description exactly. It tells us only that the text cannot be converted directly into a modern topographic diagram without making assumptions. For a story about human beginnings, this uncertainty matters. We often want origins to have a single point that can be found, measured, and visited. A place on a map feels more solid than a place in an ancient narrative. But human memory does not preserve the past only through coordinates. Communities also preserve beginnings through names, sacred landscapes, rivers, boundaries, and stories that connect a people to a larger world. Eden belongs to that kind of remembered geography. It may contain echoes of real places known to ancient writers, but the text does not allow us to separate those echoes cleanly from literary and theological meaning. This is especially important when considering the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those manuscripts can help us study how ancient Jewish communities preserved and interpreted texts connected with Genesis, but they do not remove the geographic uncertainty already present in the story. They do not give us a missing map that suddenly identifies the garden. Their importance lies elsewhere, in showing how early these traditions circulated and how seriously ancient readers treated the world of Genesis. The safest path, then, is not to choose between two extremes. We do not need to say that Eden was only a symbol with no relationship to geography, and we do not need to claim that its exact location has been discovered. We can remain with what the evidence permits. The narrative places human origins in a structured landscape. Water flows through it, regions are named around it, directions matter, access matters. The garden has a place within Eden, and Eden has relationships with a world beyond the garden. That is already enough to change the familiar picture. The first question is no longer simply where paradise stood. The deeper question is why the story of human beginnings was remembered through geography at all, and what those rivers, lands, and boundaries were meant to communicate to people who lived long before modern maps existed. Before an attempt to locate Eden can be responsible, that distinction has to remain clear. A text can preserve geographic memory without functioning as a survey, and a place name can carry meaning even when its equivalent is uncertain. The uncertainty does not empty Eden of value. It defines the limits within which the evidence can be read without turning possibility into fact. One of the most unusual details in the Eden account appears before the four famous river names are introduced. Genesis first describes a single river flowing out of Eden to water the garden, and only afterwards says that from there it divided and became four branches. That sequence is easy to overlook because modern readers often jump immediately to the names Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates, hoping that familiar geography will reveal a location. But the structure of the passage asks us to notice something earlier. Water begins in relation to Eden, reaches the garden, and then extends outward toward a wider world. The image is not simply of four unrelated rivers surrounding paradise. It is of one source or flow connected with Eden before a larger river system appears. For a story concerned with human beginnings, that arrangement gives water a central place in the landscape. The first human environment is described as dependent on a flow that does not originate inside the garden itself. It comes from Eden and waters the place where human life is established. This does not prove that the writer was describing a hydrological system that once existed exactly as written. Ancient descriptions of landscapes could combine remembered geography, literary structure, and theological meaning. Yet it would also be careless to ignore the physical importance of water in the ancient Near East. Settlements, cultivated land, animals, and human survival depended heavily on reliable access to water. A river could make the difference between fertile ground and dry terrain, between a place that could support repeated occupation and one that could not. When Genesis places a river at the center of the human beginning, the image would have carried practical weight as well as symbolic meaning. The movement of water also creates a direction. Eden is not presented as an isolated enclosure cut off from everything beyond it. Something flows outward. The garden receives water, and the river then becomes connected with lands that lie beyond the immediate human dwelling. This makes the geography dynamic rather than static. The landscape has circulation. It has a center, and outward movement, and relationships between places. That pattern matters because the story of human origins soon becomes a story of movement as well. Human beings begin within a protected space and later live outside it. Water, however, is already crossing those boundaries before the human departure occurs. The wider world is therefore present from the beginning, not introduced only after the loss of the garden. We should still resist turning this structure into a map. Rivers in the known world do not simply converge into a neat diagram that reproduces the Genesis description, and attempts to force modern waterways into the pattern usually depend on uncertain identifications or reconstructed landscapes that cannot be demonstrated with confidence. The safest reading begins with what the text actually preserves. One river associated with Eden and the garden, followed by 4 named waterways linked with wider regions. That is enough to raise an important question without pretending to solve it. If Eden were merely another name for the garden, the description of a river flowing from Eden to water the garden would be strangely redundant. If Eden is understood as the larger setting, the wording becomes more spatially coherent. The garden occupies a particular place, while water arrives from the broader Eden landscape and then continues outward. This still does not tell us whether Eden was imagined as a valley, a highland, a distant region, or a sacred landscape shaped partly by literary tradition. Those possibilities remain open. What the river does give us is a relationship between human beginnings and the surrounding world. The first human home is not self-contained. Its life depends on something that enters it, nourishes it, and continues beyond it. Long before anyone tried to locate Eden on a modern map, the story had already tied human origins to a larger geography through the movement of water. Water is one of the simplest things in the Eden story, yet it carries more weight than it first appears to. The garden is not described as surviving by itself. It is watered by a river connected with Eden, and that detail places human beginnings inside an environment where life depends on a continuing flow. In the ancient Near East, this would not have been an abstract idea. Water determined where communities could remain, where crops could grow, where animals could be supported, and how people moved through dry landscapes. Rivers, springs, seasonal rainfall, and irrigation shape the rhythms of settlement. None of this means that Genesis should be read as a farming manual, but it helps explain why water could serve as such a powerful organizing feature in a story about the beginning of human life. A landscape with reliable water was not simply beautiful, it was habitable. This makes the river in Eden important even before any attempt is made to identify its later branches. The story links the first human dwelling with abundance, but that abundance is not presented as magic appearing from nowhere. It is connected with a physical process that ancient listeners understood immediately. Land lives when water reaches it. The same connection between water and human survival appears across many early societies, especially where settlement depended on river valleys or controlled access to seasonal flows. Yet the Eden account also goes beyond ordinary survival. The river does not stop at the garden. It moves outward and becomes connected with lands beyond the first human home. Water therefore joins the protected center with a larger world. The garden is nourished by the same movement that reaches beyond it, which means the human beginning is already connected to places outside the immediate scene. This is one reason the geography should not be reduced to decorative background. The environment helps organize the story itself. A central place receives life, while the surrounding world is linked to it through water. Ancient readers did not need modern hydrology to understand the significance of such a pattern. They lived in worlds where a river could mark a route, a border, a source of food, a political resource, and a memory carried across generations. Still, the practical importance of rivers should not tempt us into treating every feature as literal topography. Ancient texts often allowed physical landscapes to carry moral, sacred, and social meaning at the same time. A river could be real and still become part of a larger way of describing order. The safest approach is therefore to hold both possibilities together without forcing either one. Genesis uses features recognizable from real human environments, but it arranges them within a narrative about origins. That matters because the first humans in the story are not imagined outside ecology. They need a place that can support life. They are surrounded by plants, animals, soil, and water. Even if the account cannot be used to reconstruct a prehistoric settlement, it reflects a basic truth about human existence that reaches back to our earliest origins. People can survive only within environmental systems that provide water, food, and usable land. The story remembers that dependence through a landscape of flowing water. Later generations could interpret Eden in increasingly sacred ways, but beneath those interpretations remains something physically understandable. Human life begins in relation to a place, and that place is sustained by resources no human being creates alone. The river is therefore not merely a clue to where Eden might have been. It is also a clue to how ancient people imagined the conditions that made human life possible. Before the four rivers become a geographic problem, water itself establishes the deeper pattern. The first human home is meaningful because it is connected to a living landscape rather than separated from one. That relationship will matter when the text begins naming the lands downstream. The first real geographic difficulty appears when the single river of Eden is compared with the four rivers that follow, because the passage sounds precise enough to invite mapping while remaining too incomplete to produce one secure map. And this tension has shaped almost every later attempt to locate Eden, since two names seem familiar and two others remain uncertain, making the description feel partly anchored in the known world and partly resistant to it. The Tigris and Euphrates belong to the geography of Mesopotamia and can still be recognized today, yet the Pishon and Gihon cannot be identified with the same confidence, while the lands associated with them also raise questions about how ancient names were used, remembered, or transferred across time. So the problem is not simply that modern readers have failed to find the correct rivers, but that the text itself does not provide enough information to know whether all four names were meant to correspond to waterways that could ever be placed together on a modern physical map. This becomes even more important when we consider the shape of the river system, because Genesis presents one river connected with Eden and the garden before describing four branches, whereas the rivers known from Mesopotamia do not form an obvious arrangement that matches this pattern. And although landscapes can change over long periods through shifts in channels, sediment, flooding, and changes in coastlines, those processes should not be used as a convenient way to prove whichever reconstruction we prefer, because geological possibility is not the same as textual or archaeological confirmation. For a story about human beginnings, the uncertainty itself may be more informative than a forced solution, since it reminds us that ancient descriptions of place were created within cultures that did not separate physical geography, remembered territory, sacred meaning, and inherited tradition in the same way modern maps do. And a river name could point toward a recognizable region, while still carrying associations beyond its measurable course. This does not mean the rivers are imaginary, nor does it mean the account secretly encodes a lost scientific map. It means only that the surviving description belongs to a different intellectual world, one in which a place could be situated through relationships rather than coordinates, through what lay beside it, what flowed from it, what surrounded it, and what it meant to the people who preserved the story. That distinction becomes important when thinking about the beginnings of humanity, because origin stories often connect people to landscapes that explain not only where life begins, but also how humans understand abundance, distance, separation, and loss. And Eden is already beginning to function in that way, with water linking the first human dwelling to regions beyond it, while the precise arrangement remains beyond recovery. If we insist that every element must correspond neatly to a present river, we risk turning uncertainty into false certainty. Yet, if we dismiss every geographic name as symbolism, we lose the fact that the story deliberately places human origins among recognizable features of the ancient world. The responsible position lies between those extremes, allowing the Tigris and Euphrates to remain meaningful geographic anchors, while admitting that the full system cannot presently be reconstructed with confidence. Rather than weakening the story, this limit helps us read it more carefully, because human origins are being placed within a remembered landscape whose meaning survives more clearly than its measurable boundaries, and the distance between those two forms of knowledge will become essential when the individual river names are examined one by one. And this is the first major warning against treating Eden as a solved location, because the moment the four rivers are placed together, the apparent clarity of the map begins to dissolve, leaving us not with an answer, but with a more precise question about what kind of geography the ancient text was trying to preserve. Among the four rivers associated with Eden, two names immediately create a sense of familiarity: the Tigris and the Euphrates. Unlike Pishon and Gihon, whose identities remain uncertain, these two rivers are firmly connected with the geography of Mesopotamia, the broad region between and around the great river systems of what is now mainly Iraq and neighboring areas. Their presence in Genesis gives the Eden account an important connection with a landscape that ancient communities actually knew, traveled through, cultivated, fought over, and remembered. Yet this familiarity can easily mislead us. Recognizing two river names does not mean that the location of Eden has been solved. It means only that the story of human beginnings is partly framed through geographic names that belong to the world of its ancient readers. The Tigris and Euphrates were not minor streams. They shaped some of the most important agricultural and urban landscapes of the ancient Near East. Communities depended on their waters, although the relationship between rivers and settlement varied greatly from place to place and across long periods of time. Flooding, irrigation, changing channels, and human management of water all influenced where people could live and how societies developed. Long before anyone tried to draw Eden on a modern map, these rivers already carried associations with fertile land, dangerous floods, political centers, trade routes, and the fragile dependence of human communities on water. Their appearance in a narrative about human origins therefore would not have been neutral. They connected the story with a world in which rivers could support life while also reminding people that human survival depended on forces larger than any single community. One of the names in Genesis is traditionally understood as the Tigris, while the Euphrates appears with a name that remained recognizable across ancient traditions. That recognition is valuable, but it gives us only part of the geographic picture. If two rivers can be located and two cannot, then the temptation is to use the known rivers as fixed points and force the uncertain ones into nearby landscapes. Many proposed locations for Eden have followed some version of this approach. The difficulty is that the complete river system described in Genesis does not correspond neatly to the modern courses of the Tigris and Euphrates. These rivers do not simply emerge as two branches from a single stream flowing out of a clearly identifiable Eden. Their headwaters, tributaries, and directions create a much more complicated physical geography. Landscapes have certainly changed over long stretches of history, especially in river plains where sediment accumulates and channels shift, but such changes cannot automatically be used to fill every gap in the text. A landscape could have been different without ever matching a particular reconstruction. For the question of human beginnings, this distinction matters because the desire to find an exact origin point can become stronger than the evidence. Human populations did not emerge from one remembered garden within historical Mesopotamia in the way a literal modern map might suggest. The scientific study of human origins places the much deeper biological history of our species in Africa, over timescales far older than the written traditions of Genesis. The Eden story belongs to a different kind of inquiry. How ancient people understood the human condition, the world around them, and the idea of a lost beginning. Recognizing the Tigris and Euphrates does not collapse these two forms of knowledge into one. Instead, it shows how an ancient origin narrative could be anchored in geographic features familiar to the communities preserving it. Real rivers could become part of a remembered landscape without turning the entire narrative into a geographical report. This is why the two familiar names are so important. They keep Eden from floating completely outside the known world, yet they do not allow us to place it securely within that world either. The story touches Mesopotamian geography without becoming reducible to Mesopotamian geography. The rivers offer orientation but not coordinates. They remind us that the ancient imagination of human beginnings was built from landscapes people could recognize, even when the larger arrangement could no longer be reconstructed with confidence. The Tigris and Euphrates therefore do not answer where Eden was. They deepen the puzzle by showing that part of the geography is recognizably real while the whole remains unresolved. Once the Tigris and Euphrates enter the Eden account, Mesopotamia naturally becomes one of the first regions modern readers consider. Because both rivers shaped the landscape of ancient Iraq and neighboring areas, and because some of the earliest known cities, farming systems, and written traditions developed within that broader world. The connection is understandable, but it is important to distinguish a reasonable geographic association from a proven location. Genesis does not say that Eden was a city in Mesopotamia, and it does not provide a sequence of directions that allows us to travel from a known settlement to the garden. What it does provide is a set of river names that partly overlap with the geography of the ancient Near East. That overlap matters because stories of human beginnings are often told through places familiar to the communities preserving them. Mesopotamia was a landscape where rivers structured nearly everything. Water determined where fields could be cultivated, where settlements could endure, and how political centers connected with surrounding land. The Tigris and Euphrates also changed course over long periods, especially across their lower plains, where sediment, flooding, and human intervention continually altered channels and wetlands. These changes remind us that the modern river map is not identical to the ancient one, but they do not give us permission to reconstruct any river system we want. Geological change can explain why ancient landscapes differed from present landscapes. It cannot by itself prove that a particular lost configuration was the geography of Eden. This is where many confident claims become fragile. A proposed location may begin with the genuine fact that the Tigris and Euphrates are real rivers, then add assumptions about unidentified waterways, ancient coastlines, vanished channels, or translated place names until the entire description appears to fit. The final picture can look persuasive even when several of its steps remain uncertain. For a careful reading, each step has to remain visible. The two familiar rivers are evidence. The identification of the other rivers is debated. The exact relationship among all four is unresolved. Eden itself has not been archaeologically identified. Keeping those distinctions clear is especially important when the story is placed beside what science tells us about human origins. Our species did not begin as a historical population in Mesopotamia within the period represented by ancient written texts. The deeper biological history of Homo sapiens reaches far earlier and is rooted in Africa. Genesis is therefore not a scientific account of speciation or prehistoric population history. It belongs to the world of ancient traditions, asking what human beings are, why they labor, why they die, why relationships can fracture, and why the world seems both life-giving and difficult. Mesopotamian geography may have helped ancient writers and audiences imagine those questions within a recognizable landscape. That makes the rivers historically meaningful without turning them into evidence for a single birthplace of humanity. The distinction also brings us closer to the central question of Eden. If the story uses real geographic names within a larger literary landscape, then the presence of Mesopotamia may tell us more about the horizon of the people who preserved the tradition than about a recoverable prehistoric garden. The rivers anchor the story in the known world, but they do not close the distance between memory and map. This restraint does not weaken the investigation. It makes the surviving clues more useful, because they can be compared without forcing them into agreement. A real river name can preserve geographic memory, while the surrounding narrative organizes that memory for purposes other than navigation. Ancient people did not need to choose between physical landscape and cultural meaning as sharply as modern readers often do. The same river could belong to both at once. Mesopotamia enters the picture because the text itself points toward it. Yet the moment we treat that direction as a final answer, we move beyond what the evidence can securely support. The presence of the Tigris and Euphrates creates an expectation that the geography of Eden should eventually become clear, yet the opposite happens when the entire river system is considered together. Two names appear familiar enough to place on a modern map, but the larger arrangement described in Genesis refuses to settle into a single, obvious location. This tension is important because it reveals the difference between recognizing individual geographic features and reconstructing an entire ancient landscape. A modern map shows the Tigris and Euphrates rising in the highlands of what is now eastern Turkey before flowing generally southeast toward the lowlands of Mesopotamia. Their courses approach one another and eventually join far downstream, but this pattern does not easily resemble a single river flowing from Eden and then dividing into four branches. That mismatch has encouraged many attempts to explain what may have changed. River channels can move, coastlines can shift, sediment can build new land. Floods can redirect waterways, and long-term climatic changes can alter the availability of water across entire regions. These processes are real, especially in broad alluvial plains, but they cannot be used as automatic proof that the Genesis River system once existed exactly as described. A reconstructed ancient channel is only useful when supported by independent geological or archaeological evidence. Otherwise, possibility quietly becomes certainty, and the search for Eden begins producing the answer it hoped to find. The problem becomes even more difficult because the two remaining rivers, Pishon and Gihon, do not have identifications that command broad agreement. Without knowing what those names referred to, it is impossible to establish four reliable points and work backward toward one source. The map is therefore incomplete at its foundations. This does not mean that Genesis contains no geographic memory. The Tigris and Euphrates strongly suggest contact with the real landscape of the ancient Near East, while other names may also preserve memories of regions known to ancient communities in ways that are difficult for us to recover. What cannot be justified is the next leap, assuming that because some elements are recognizable, every element must fit a single physical map if we search long enough. Ancient descriptions were not always constructed according to modern expectations of drainage basins, scale, and directional precision. A river could define a region, connect peoples, or mark the edge of a known world without functioning as a coordinate line. This matters when we return to the question of human beginnings. The biological origins of our species belong to a far deeper prehistoric past than the written world represented by Genesis, and scientific evidence does not place the emergence of Homo sapiens in a garden between the Tigris and Euphrates. The Eden narrative should therefore not be made to carry a scientific claim it was not written to provide. Its geographic language can still be historically meaningful. Ancient people understood themselves through landscapes, and rivers were among the most enduring features through which memory could be organized. A river might outlast a city, a dynasty, or a political border in collective memory, even while its physical channel changed. Eden may reflect this way of remembering, a place located through relationships among waters and lands rather than through measurements. The familiar rivers draw the story toward the known world, while the unfamiliar arrangement prevents that world from becoming a solved map. That balance is more valuable than a forced identification because it preserves what the evidence actually allows us to say. Genesis places the beginning of human life within a geography that its ancient audience could partly recognize, but not one that modern readers can reconstruct with confidence. The closer we look at the rivers, the clearer that limitation becomes. Instead of revealing a hidden coordinate, the Tigris and Euphrates show us where certainty begins to weaken, and the unresolved names that follow will make that boundary even more important. The Pishon is where the geography of Eden becomes much harder to follow, because unlike the Tigris and Euphrates, this river cannot be matched with confidence to a known waterway today. Genesis describes the Pishon as flowing around, or through, a land called Havilah, a place associated in the text with valuable materials, including gold. At first glance, this sounds like the kind of information that should help narrow the search. A named river, a named land, and a description of resources appear to offer several clues at once, yet each clue becomes uncertain when examined closely. Havilah itself is difficult to locate securely, and the ancient language used to describe the river's relationship to the land does not provide the kind of directional precision expected from a modern map. Because of this, many different identifications for the Pishon have been proposed over time, linking it with waterways in Arabia, Mesopotamia, or regions farther away. None has achieved broad agreement. This is an important moment in the search for Eden because it demonstrates how quickly a geographic investigation can move from evidence into speculation. A researcher may begin with something solid, such as the fact that Genesis names the Pishon, and then add a proposed location for Havilah, a reconstructed ancient river channel, and an interpretation of where gold may have been found. Each step may be possible, but several possibilities placed together do not become certainty. For people living in the ancient Near East, names such as Havilah may have evoked regions, peoples, routes, or distant lands known through trade and inherited tradition. Those associations could have been meaningful even if their boundaries were never fixed in the way modern countries are fixed on maps. The same principle applies to rivers. A river name could survive while the precise geographic knowledge attached to it changed across generations. Waterways themselves could also shift, disappear, or become seasonal, particularly in dry regions. But this physical possibility cannot establish that any particular vanished channel was the Pishon. The distinction matters because Eden is a story about human beginnings, and beginnings often attract the strongest desire for certainty. If one unknown river could be identified, it might seem that the entire landscape would suddenly fall into place. Yet the evidence does not work that way. The Pishon reminds us that the geographical world preserved in an ancient text may be only partly recoverable. Some names remain recognizable across thousands of years, while others become detached from the places they once described. This loss is itself part of history. Human communities carry geographic memory through language, but language does not preserve every road, riverbank, boundary, or local meaning unchanged. When the story of Eden was copied and transmitted across generations, its river names remained in the text even though later readers may no longer have possessed the same geographic knowledge as those who first heard them. That possibility does not prove that the Pishon was once a clearly identifiable river, but it helps explain why an ancient name can survive after its location becomes uncertain. It also warns us against using the uncertainty as an empty space into which any preferred theory can be inserted. For the deeper question of human origins, the Pishon contributes something more useful than a missing coordinate. It shows that the Eden narrative connects the first human environment with a wider world containing distinct lands, resources, and waterways. The garden does not float outside geography. It exists within a network of places that ancient readers could imagine as connected, even if modern readers cannot reconstruct all of them. The Pishon therefore marks a boundary between what the text preserves and what history has allowed us to recover. We know the name, we know the relationship Genesis gives it to Havilah. Beyond that, certainty rapidly decreases. And that narrowing of certainty is not a failure of the investigation. It is one of the clearest clues to how carefully Eden must be approached. Havilah appears in the Eden account as though it should help us narrow the geography. Yet the closer we look, the less certain the landscape becomes, because Genesis connects the Pishon with a land called Havilah, and then associates that land with valuable materials, including gold. But the name Havilah does not point securely to one location that can be identified on a modern map. And this uncertainty is important because ancient place names did not always function like modern national borders. A name could refer to a region, a people, a territory known through trade, or an area whose limits changed over generations. So when Havilah appears in different biblical contexts, we should not assume automatically that every use refers to exactly the same geographic space. Nor should we take the presence of gold as a simple coordinate that can lead us directly back to Eden, since many regions across the ancient world were associated with valuable minerals and trade goods, and ancient descriptions of wealth could indicate how a place was remembered rather than provide a geological survey, which means that the reference to gold gives Havilah character without giving us a secure location. And this is where the difference between ancient geographic memory and modern mapping becomes especially clear, because today we expect a place to have defined borders, standardized names, and coordinates that remain stable across documents, while ancient communities often understood distant regions through routes, neighboring peoples, resources, rivers, deserts, mountains, and stories carried by merchants or travelers. So a name like Havilah may once have evoked a recognizable zone of the world for people familiar with those traditions, even though that geographic knowledge is no longer recoverable with confidence. And for the Eden question, this matters greatly because Havilah is sometimes treated as though identifying it would automatically identify the Pishon and then reveal the location of the garden. But that reasoning depends on several uncertain steps being treated as certain at the same time. First, Havilah must be placed securely. Then the relationship between Havilah and the Pishon must be understood in physical terms. Then the Pishon must be connected with the other rivers. And finally, the entire river system must be made to fit the description of Eden. Yet none of those later steps follows automatically from the first. So, the responsible approach is to keep each level of confidence separate. The text clearly preserves the name Havilah. It clearly associates that land with the Pishon, and it clearly describes valuable materials there. But the surviving evidence does not allow us to draw a reliable boundary around Havilah, or use it as a fixed point from which Eden can be triangulated. This does not make the name meaningless. On the contrary, it tells us something important about how the story locates human beginnings within a wider world. The garden is not presented as an isolated pocket floating outside ordinary geography. It is connected through water to lands that possess names, resources, and relationships, which suggests that the world beyond the first human dwelling was already imagined as differentiated. One place was not simply interchangeable with another, and this is significant when thinking about how human communities remember origins. Because people tend to place beginnings within landscapes that contain meaningful distinctions. Some areas provide water, some contain valuable materials, some lie beyond familiar boundaries, and some become important because generations continue to name them even after the original geography becomes difficult to recover. Havilah may represent precisely this kind of surviving geographic memory, a name preserved more successfully than the detailed map once associated with it. And that possibility should make us cautious rather than disappointed. Because ancient texts often preserve fragments of spatial knowledge unevenly, a river can remain famous while a neighboring land disappears from common memory. A regional name can survive while its boundaries shift, and a resource can remain associated with a place long after the routes leading there are forgotten. None of this allows us to claim that Havilah was imaginary, but neither does it allow us to choose one modern region and declare the problem solved. What we can say is simpler and more useful. The Eden narrative remembers the first human environment as connected to a world of rivers and named lands. And Havilah is one of the places that makes that world feel geographically textured, while simultaneously reminding us how much of its original spatial framework has been lost. So instead of functioning as the clue that finally fixes Eden on a map, Havilah becomes evidence of the limits of that map, showing that the ancient story preserves enough geography to suggest a wider landscape, but not enough to recover that landscape with certainty. The uncertainty surrounding the Pishon may seem like a small problem beside the larger question of Eden, but one missing river changes almost everything about the attempt to reconstruct the landscape. If the Eden account had named 4 waterways that could all be identified with reasonable confidence, their courses might at least provide a framework for comparison. Instead, the picture contains only partial anchors. The Tigris and Euphrates can be recognized, while the Pishon remains uncertain, and the land of Havilah cannot be fixed securely enough to solve the problem. This means that any proposed map must begin filling gaps before it can even test whether the whole system fits. Once that happens, a reconstruction can become persuasive simply because its assumptions support one another. A suspected ancient channel is identified as the Pishon because it lies near a proposed Havilah, while Havilah is placed there because the region seems compatible with the proposed river. The reasoning can form a circle without producing independent confirmation. This is why one unidentified river matters so much. Geography is strongest when several separate clues converge on the same conclusion. Here, one of the basic clues remains unstable, so every conclusion built upon it must remain provisional. That restraint is especially important because rivers are not permanent lines cut into the earth. Over long periods, channels migrate, wetlands expand or contract, coastlines move, sediments accumulate, and some waterways disappear from the surface. Archaeology and earth science can sometimes reconstruct parts of these older landscapes, but a vanished channel does not become the Pishon merely because it once carried water in a region someone has proposed for Eden. The same caution applies to human origins. Our species has a deep biological history that cannot be reduced to one ancient literary landscape, while the Eden narrative belongs to a later world of remembered places, inherited traditions, and questions about the human condition. Confusing those two levels can make a geographic theory appear to explain more than it actually does. The Pishon therefore teaches a useful lesson about evidence. Absence of identification is not evidence for whichever identification remains attractive. It is simply uncertainty. Ancient readers may have understood the name far better than we do, or the name may already have carried layers of older memory when the text reached the form we know. Either possibility is reasonable to consider, but neither can be demonstrated strongly enough to restore the missing map. The consequence is not that Eden must be dismissed as meaningless geography. On the contrary, the text still presents human beginnings within a world of named lands, flowing water, resources, and directions. What changes is the kind of question we can responsibly ask. Instead of asking which modern river must be the Pishon, we can ask why the narrative needed four rivers at all, why some names connect with recognizable regions while others do not, and how ancient communities used geography to imagine a beginning that stood both near the known world and beyond ordinary access. That shift prevents uncertainty from becoming a weakness. It allows the lost river to reveal the limits of our knowledge while preserving the structure of the story. One missing river matters because Eden cannot be located by selecting only the clues that survive clearly and treating the rest as adjustable. A map built that way would tell us more about modern expectations than about the ancient text. The result is a quieter but more reliable picture of the human beginning described in Genesis. The landscape remains ordered enough to carry meaning, yet incomplete enough to resist certainty. That combination may be exactly why the river problem has endured for so long. The Pishon therefore becomes a boundary marker in the investigation. Beyond its name and its association with Havilah, confidence falls sharply. And any honest search for Eden has to carry that uncertainty forward rather than quietly removing it. The Gihon introduces a second major uncertainty into the geography of Eden, and in some ways it is even more difficult than the Pishon, because the river is connected with a land called Cush, a name that appears elsewhere in ancient biblical traditions but does not always allow a simple geographic identification in this particular passage. Genesis describes the Gihon as flowing around or through the land of Cush, yet that statement does not give us enough information to determine which river the ancient writer had in mind. Later readers have proposed different possibilities, sometimes connecting Cush with regions south of Egypt, sometimes suggesting areas closer to Mesopotamia, and sometimes arguing that the geographic vocabulary may have reflected traditions that cannot now be reconstructed securely. None of these proposals has produced a broadly accepted identification of the Gihon. This matters because the Eden River system now contains two different kinds of evidence at once. The Tigris and Euphrates can be connected with known rivers, while the Pishon and Gihon remain uncertain. The result is not a map with one missing detail. Half of the named river system cannot be securely placed. That should change the level of confidence with which any location for Eden is presented. The difficulty becomes clearer when we remember that ancient place names could shift in meaning across time. A name might refer to a people in one context, a territory in another, or a wider region known through political or trade relationships. Modern readers are accustomed to borders drawn with fixed lines, but ancient geographic language often operated through relationships between peoples, rivers, routes, and neighboring lands. Cush is therefore important, but it cannot simply be transferred from one passage to another and treated as though every occurrence must describe exactly the same territory. The wording surrounding Gihon has also created another temptation. Because a well-known spring near Jerusalem later carried the name Gihon, some readers have wondered whether there might be a direct connection with Eden. Yet sharing a name does not by itself establish that two geographic features are the same, especially when the Eden account describes a river associated with a wider land. Ancient names could be reused, and traditions could develop around important places over time. A responsible reading must therefore begin with the limits of what can actually be demonstrated. We have the name Gihon. We have its textual association with Cush. We do not have a secure modern river that can be identified as the Gihon of Eden. For the larger question of human beginnings, this uncertainty reveals something important about the distance between an ancient remembered landscape and the modern world. Human beings preserve places through names, but names can survive even after the geographic knowledge behind them becomes fragmentary. Rivers change, settlements disappear, populations move, languages develop, and political regions are reorganized. Over many generations, the name of a place may continue to carry meaning while its boundaries become difficult for later readers to recover. The Eden narrative may preserve exactly this kind of uneven geographic memory. Some elements remain recognizable because they continue to be major features of the ancient Near East. Others have become obscure because the connections that once made them understandable have been lost. This does not prove that Gihon was once a river known to everyone who heard the story, but it explains why uncertainty today does not automatically mean that the ancient name was meaningless. At the same time, uncertainty cannot be converted into evidence for a preferred theory. If the Gihon is identified only after Eden has already been placed somewhere, the reasoning becomes reversed. Instead of allowing the river to help locate the landscape, the proposed landscape is being used to choose the river. That method can produce an attractive map, but it cannot produce strong historical confidence. The Gihon therefore strengthens the same lesson introduced by the Pishon. Eden is described through geography, yet that geography is only partly recoverable. The human beginning in Genesis is placed within a world connected by water and named lands, but the surviving text does not allow those relationships to be translated cleanly into modern coordinates. The second uncertain river makes this limitation impossible to ignore, and moves the investigation toward a more careful question. Not simply where Eden was, but how ancient people understood the relationship between a sacred beginning and the wider geography they believed surrounded it. The name Cush can look deceptively simple because modern readers often expect an ancient place name to correspond to one fixed region, but the biblical world was not organized through modern borders, and the meaning of a geographic name could depend heavily on the period, the text, and the people being described. In many biblical passages, Cush is associated broadly with lands south of Egypt, especially regions connected with Nubia and the Upper Nile, and this association is important because it shows that the name belonged to a real geographic vocabulary known to ancient writers. Yet the appearance of Cush beside the Gihon in the Eden account creates a problem. If the Gihon is imagined as a river flowing around a southern land associated with the Nile world, it becomes difficult to place that river within the same simple physical system as the Tigris and Euphrates. Some interpreters have therefore proposed that the Cush of Genesis may have referred to a different region, perhaps one closer to Mesopotamia, while others have argued that the text reflects a geographic conception that cannot be reconstructed through modern drainage maps. The surviving evidence does not allow one of these possibilities to be declared certain. This uncertainty is useful because it reminds us that ancient geography was often relational rather than coordinate-based. A land might be understood through the peoples who lived there, the routes that reached it, the goods that came from it, the kingdoms nearby, or its position at the edge of a familiar political world. Borders could change, names could move with populations, and the same word could accumulate associations across generations. Ancient readers did not carry standardized atlases in which every occurrence of Cush had to occupy an identical colored area. They inherited names through story, trade, warfare, migration, administration, and religious tradition. For the Eden narrative, this means that Cush should not be treated as a pin that can simply be dropped onto one modern country and then used to calculate the location of the garden. The question is more complicated. What would the name have suggested to the audience preserving this story? It may have evoked distance, a recognized people, a region beyond the immediate homeland, or a part of the wider world known through inherited geographic traditions. Whatever the precise association, the important point is that Eden is being related to lands beyond the garden itself. Human beginnings are placed within a spatial imagination, extending outward toward named territories. This pattern appears repeatedly in the passage. Eden is larger than the garden, water moves outward, rivers are named, and those rivers are connected with lands that possess their own identities. The first human environment is therefore not presented as an isolated sphere unrelated to the rest of the earth. It belongs to a wider geography, even when that geography cannot be reconstructed completely. This matters for understanding the story without confusing it with the scientific history of our species. Modern evidence for human biological origins comes from fossils, archaeology, genetics, and the study of ancient environments, and it points to a deep African history for Homo sapiens, long before the composition of biblical texts. The geographic language of Eden belongs instead to an ancient cultural attempt to describe human beginnings within a meaningful world. Recognizing this distinction allows us to take the geography seriously without asking it to function as prehistoric science. Cush can therefore remain a real ancient geographic name while its role in the Eden passage remains uncertain. That combination is not contradictory. A writer can use known names inside a larger literary geography whose overall structure serves purposes beyond navigation. The same pattern appears in many ancient traditions, where familiar mountains, rivers, cities, or peoples become part of stories that organize the world morally and culturally as well as physically. The Gihon and Cush may function within such a framework. Their presence tells us that the story reaches beyond the immediate garden toward a larger inhabited or imaginable world, but it does not give us enough information to draw the route between those places with confidence. This is where the desire for a precise Eden can become misleading. If Cush is fixed too quickly in Northeast Africa, the river system becomes difficult to reconcile physically. If Cush is moved toward Mesopotamia mainly to make the rivers fit, the solution risks being created by the theory itself. A careful reading leaves that tension unresolved. The ancient name remains meaningful, the geographic problem remains genuine, and the uncertainty remains part of the evidence. By allowing Cush to retain that ambiguity, we begin to see that the Eden account may be organizing space according to more than one principle at once: recognizable geography, inherited memory, and the larger meaning of a human beginning positioned at the center of a world that extends far beyond the garden. When the four rivers are finally considered together, the geography of Eden becomes less like a puzzle waiting for one missing answer, and more like a layered description of space, because two rivers can be linked with confidence to the Tigris and Euphrates, while the Pishon and Gihon remain uncertain, and the lands of Havilah and Cush cannot be placed in a single arrangement accepted by all readers, which means the passage contains both recognizable geography and unresolved geography at the same time. A combination that is difficult only if we assume that every ancient description of place must behave like a modern map, since modern maps are designed to preserve scale, direction, drainage, and measurable relationships. While ancient geographic descriptions worked through names, routes, peoples, resources, boundaries, sacred centers, and relationships, so a place could be meaningful because of what surrounded it or what flowed from it, even when no precise coordinate was supplied. And Eden seems to belong to this older way of organizing space, with a garden located within a setting, a river associated with that setting, four named waterways extending the landscape outward, and lands connected to those waters. Yet the system does not settle into a physical pattern that can be transferred onto the present world, and that tension should be preserved, because it may tell us something about the purpose of the description itself. The text appears interested in locating human beginnings within an ordered world rather than leaving them in an undefined paradise. But order does not necessarily mean cartographic precision. It can also mean that the world has a center and an outside sources and destinations, accessible places and forbidden ones, familiar regions and distant regions, and the movement of water ties those spaces together, which helps explain why the four rivers matter even when two cannot be securely identified. For the narrative does not simply say that the first human beings lived somewhere pleasant. It connects their beginning with a landscape that reaches beyond them, and this makes Eden part of a wider conception of the world rather than an isolated enclosure. The scientific story of human origins is reconstructed through fossils, archaeology, genetics, and ancient environments, and points to a deep African history for our species, while Genesis belongs to a later textual world that asks different questions about human place, dependence, limits, work, loss, and belonging. So the river system should not be used as evidence for the biological birthplace of Homo sapiens. Yet it can still reveal how ancient communities imagined the beginning of human life within the geography they knew or remembered. And this is where the mixed nature of the four rivers becomes especially important, because the familiar names keep the story connected to real landscapes while the uncertain names prevent that connection from becoming a simple historical coordinate. Perhaps ancient audiences recognized associations that are no longer recoverable, perhaps some names had accumulated different meanings, or perhaps the arrangement was never intended to function as a drainage map in the modern sense. But none of these possibilities can be established strongly enough to become a final explanation. So the responsible reading leaves them open, and pays attention instead to the pattern that remains clear. Eden stands at the center of a world imagined through flowing water and named lands. The garden occupies only one place within that larger setting, and the rivers connect the beginning of human life to regions beyond the first dwelling, which means the geographic language is doing more than identifying terrain. It is organizing relationships between center and distance, abundance and movement, belonging and separation. And once that is recognized, the four rivers no longer need to produce one perfect map in order to matter, because their deeper importance may lie in showing how an ancient text could anchor human origins in a world that was simultaneously physical, remembered, and meaningful. The Dead Sea Scrolls enter the Eden question at a point where modern imagination often moves faster than the evidence. Because the scrolls are ancient, fragmentary, and associated with biblical texts, they are sometimes treated as though they contain forgotten information capable of revealing where Eden once stood. That is not what the surviving manuscripts provide. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a large collection of Jewish writings preserved near the Dead Sea, including biblical manuscripts, interpretive works, community texts, prayers, legal writings, and other compositions from the Second Temple period. Among them are manuscripts connected with Genesis, but there is no hidden map of Eden, no recovered set of coordinates, and no document that allows scholars to identify the garden securely on modern terrain. Their importance is different, and, in some ways, more interesting. They bring us much closer to the ancient textual world, in which stories such as Genesis were copied, read, transmitted, and interpreted. Before their discovery, the Hebrew biblical manuscripts available to scholars came mainly from much later periods. The Qumran discoveries revealed copies and fragments that were many centuries older, allowing researchers to compare how biblical texts existed in antiquity and to see that Jewish literary culture during this period was broader than a single fixed collection of writings. For the question of Eden, this changes the investigation from a search for a secret location into a study of how ancient readers understood the story. The scrolls show that Genesis belonged to a living textual environment. Biblical narratives could be copied carefully, retold, expanded, interpreted, and placed beside other works dealing with creation, sacred history, law, angels, human origins, and the ordering of the world. This does not mean every text found near Qumran represents one community or one interpretation, and scholars continue to debate important questions about who produced, collected, and used particular manuscripts. What can be said safely is that the discoveries preserve evidence of a diverse Jewish literary world from the centuries around the end of the Second Temple period. That context matters because later traditions often compress Eden into a familiar image of a perfect garden, while ancient interpretations could emphasize different aspects of the story, including sacred space, boundaries, human responsibility, and the relationship between the first dwelling and the wider world. The scrolls therefore do not move us closer to Eden by shortening the physical distance between the garden and a modern archaeological site. They move us closer in another sense, by reducing some of the historical distance between us and ancient people who read traditions about the beginning of humanity. Even here, caution is necessary. A manuscript copied 2,000 years ago is still far removed from the biological origins of Homo sapiens, which belong to a much deeper prehistoric past. The scrolls cannot tell us where our species first evolved, and they should never be used as evidence against the scientific record of human origins. What they can reveal is how ancient Jewish readers inherited and reshaped stories about where human life began, why a privileged place was lost, and how sacred geography could organize memory. This distinction protects both history and science. The Dead Sea Scrolls are extraordinary because they preserve ancient voices, not because they supply a forbidden answer. Their contribution to Eden is therefore quieter. They help us ask what the geography meant before asking where it was. That shift is essential because once the scrolls are treated as witnesses to interpretation rather than as a treasure map, texts preserved alongside biblical manuscripts can be examined without exaggerating what they prove. Some works from the same manuscript environment revisit early biblical history and organize sacred places in ways that differ from the simplified image familiar today. Those writings may help us understand how Eden could function within ancient Jewish thought, but they still cannot convert literary geography into an excavated location with any historical certainty. When fragments of Genesis from the caves near Qumran are placed beside much later Hebrew manuscripts, their importance is easy to misunderstand. They do not reveal a different story of Eden hidden from later readers, and they do not preserve a forgotten description that suddenly turns the garden into a recoverable place. Their value is more basic and more reliable. They show that portions of Genesis were being copied in Hebrew many centuries before the medieval manuscripts that became central to later study of the Hebrew Bible. Some surviving Qumran fragments contain only small portions of Genesis, while others preserve different stretches of the book, so they cannot be treated as one complete ancient copy. Even so, they allow scholars to compare wording, spelling, scribal habits, and the transmission of the text across a much longer span of time. This matters because ancient books did not pass through history as printed objects reproduced identically from one edition to the next. They were copied by hand, and handwritten transmission could preserve stable wording while also producing small differences in spelling, grammar, wording, or arrangement. The Dead Sea Scrolls made that history visible in a new way. In many places, the biblical manuscripts from Qumran are close to forms of the Hebrew text familiar from later tradition. In other places, differences appear, reminding us that the textual world of the Second Temple period contained a degree of variation. That does not mean there were countless unrelated versions of Genesis, and it certainly does not mean that a suppressed Eden narrative was removed before the medieval period. It means that textual transmission was a human historical process, and the evidence must be examined manuscript by manuscript rather than turned into a story of concealment. For the geography of Eden, this creates an important boundary. The Qumran Genesis fragments are valuable witnesses to the antiquity and transmission of the text, but they do not provide a second riverless that resolves Pishon or Gihon, nor do they supply coordinates for Eden. Their silence on such a solution is significant because it prevents the scrolls from being used honestly as proof that the garden has been located. What the manuscripts give us instead is historical depth. They place the Genesis tradition inside a Jewish literary world that existed long before the medieval codices through which much of the Hebrew Bible was later preserved. Around these biblical manuscripts were other Jewish writings that retold, interpreted, or expanded themes from ancient scripture. This wider environment becomes especially important for Eden because interpretation can reveal what ancient readers thought a place meant even when it cannot tell us where that place stood. The difference is subtle but essential. A manuscript can bring us closer to the history of a story without bringing us physically closer to the location described by that story. The Qumran fragments shorten the distance between modern readers and ancient textual transmission, not the distance between a modern traveler and Eden. This also helps keep the question of human origins in the correct frame. The manuscripts belong to historical communities living thousands of years after the much deeper biological emergence of our species. They cannot function as evidence for where Homo sapiens evolved. Their value lies in showing how an ancient tradition about human beginnings was preserved and read. Once that distinction is maintained, the Dead Sea Scrolls become more useful, not less mysterious. They allow us to see that Genesis had a long manuscript history before the surviving medieval Hebrew codices, while giving no support to the idea that those later manuscripts erased a geographic key to Eden. The next step is therefore not to search the fragments for a missing coordinate, but to look at what other ancient writings from the same broad textual world did with Eden when they interpreted the inherited story. That distinction will matter when interpretation becomes our evidence. What survived at Qumran is not a complete window onto every belief ancient Jews held about Eden, and what did not survive cannot be safely reconstructed as though it were merely missing from a damaged page. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve an uneven body of manuscripts, biblical texts, interpretations, prayers, legal writings, community rules, and other works from the Second Temple period. Some survive in substantial portions, while others exist only as fragments. This uneven survival matters because modern readers can mistake the accidents of preservation for a complete record of ancient thought. A text found in several copies may have been important to some readers, but the absence of another text does not prove that nobody knew it, rejected it, or deliberately removed it. The caves preserved what happened to remain there under particular historical conditions, not a perfect catalog of every idea circulating in the ancient Jewish world. For Eden, this distinction is essential. The manuscripts give us older witnesses to biblical traditions and preserve other writings that revisit early sacred history, but they do not contain a document that resolves the four rivers, identifies a hidden coordinate, or provides an alternative geographic description that can be verified archaeologically. What survives is therefore evidence for the history of text and interpretation, not for the discovery of the garden itself. Before printing, every copy had to be produced by hand. Texts could be copied, studied, and interpreted by communities separated by generations. Some wording remained stable, while other passages show variation. The Dead Sea Scrolls allow scholars to observe part of that process at a much earlier stage than the medieval Hebrew manuscripts central to later biblical study. They show that ancient Jewish readers encountered scripture within a wider literary environment rather than as isolated books detached from related traditions. That environment is valuable for a story about human beginnings because later interpretations could emphasize details that modern readers barely notice. Eden could be considered in relation to sacred space, access, purity, cosmic order, or the history of humanity without any of those interpretations becoming a physical map. This is where the distinction between survival and loss matters. We have lost enormous amounts of writing from the ancient world because manuscripts decay, communities change, and historical disruptions interrupt transmission. It would be unreasonable to assume that every interpretation of Eden once discussed has reached us. Yet the existence of lost texts does not give us permission to invent their contents. We cannot say that a missing scroll once explained where Eden stood simply because such a document would solve a modern mystery. Historical honesty requires accepting an uncomfortable boundary. Some information may be permanently unrecoverable. That boundary is especially relevant to the deeper question of human origins. Biological evidence tells a story extending far beyond the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, while the manuscripts tell us how much later communities reflected on beginnings through inherited sacred traditions. These are different layers of the human past. The scrolls do not bridge them by revealing a prehistoric memory preserved unchanged from the emergence of Homo sapiens. What they preserve is a later history of reading, copying, remembering, and interpreting. That history still has value because it shows how questions about origin remained alive. Ancient readers were also asking what kind of world humans entered, what boundaries shaped life, why access to an ideal beginning was lost, and how sacred places related to ordinary space. The surviving manuscripts let us approach that intellectual world cautiously. They do not restore everything that disappeared, but they reveal enough to change the direction of the investigation. Instead of searching the caves for a concealed answer to Eden, we can ask how texts from this period expanded the meaning of Eden itself. Some preserved works do not give us coordinates but do show that Eden could be understood as more than a beautiful garden, and that shift is more securely grounded than any claim that the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal a forgotten location. The Book of Jubilees gives us one of the clearest examples of how ancient Jewish readers could return to Genesis and reorganize its stories without claiming to replace them. Preserved in fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls, Jubilees retells much of Genesis and the opening part of Exodus, placing familiar events inside a carefully ordered account of sacred history. Its presence at Qumran matters because it shows that stories about the beginning of humanity were not merely copied and left untouched. They were also interpreted, expanded, and connected with questions that mattered to later Jewish communities. Yet Jubilees must be approached carefully. It is not a secret version of Genesis, and it does not preserve a hidden map showing where Eden once stood. Nothing in the surviving fragments allows us to identify the garden with a secure modern location. Its value lies elsewhere. It helps us see how an ancient reader could understand Eden not simply as a pleasant landscape, but as a place whose meaning depended on its position within a larger sacred order. This is an important shift because Genesis itself already gives Eden spatial structure. The garden is planted within Eden, water flows outward, rivers connect the setting with named lands, and later the human beings lose access to the place they first inhabited. Jubilees inherits that world and places early human history within an even more organized framework of times, generations, territories, and holy places. The result is not better physical geography in the modern sense. Instead, geography begins to carry another layer of meaning. A place can be important because of where it lies, but also because of what happened there, who may enter it, and how it relates to other places considered sacred. Ancient societies did not always separate these categories as sharply as we do. A mountain could be real stone and elevation while also becoming a place of divine encounter. A city could be a physical settlement while also carrying the memory of a people. In the same way, Eden could remain a place described through trees, water, and boundaries while also becoming part of a sacred geography. This matters for the question of human beginnings, because the ancient writers preserving these traditions were not trying to reconstruct the biological emergence of Homo sapiens. That much deeper history belongs to evidence from fossils, archaeology, genetics, and ancient environments. Jubilees belongs to another historical layer, the way later communities thought about the meaning of the first humans, the first dwelling, and the loss of access to an ideal beginning. The Dead Sea Scrolls bring us closer to that interpretive world. They show that a work like Jubilees circulated in Hebrew and was copied in the same broad manuscript environment in which biblical books were preserved. We should not assume that every person associated with Qumran accepted every interpretation in Jubilees, but its survival there proves that this kind of retelling was part of ancient Jewish literary culture. For Eden, the consequence is subtle but important. The question is no longer only whether Pishon or Gihon can be matched with a modern river. We also have to ask what ancient readers believed geography was doing inside the story. If Eden could function as sacred space, then rivers and boundaries may have helped organize meaning as well as terrain. Jubilees does not solve the map, it changes the kind of map we should expect. The surviving evidence points away from the idea of a concealed coordinate and toward a world in which human origins were remembered through both landscape and sacred order. That does not make Eden less geographic. It makes the geography more complex, because the place where humanity was imagined to begin could belong simultaneously to the physical vocabulary of land and water, and to a larger structure of memory, holiness, and loss, giving later readers a way to think about beginnings without turning inherited sacred geography into a modern scientific map. In the Book of Jubilees, Eden becomes more than the background of the first human story, because the garden is described within a pattern of sacred places, and that change of emphasis helps explain why a modern search for coordinates can still miss what an ancient interpreter believed was most important. Jubilees treats the Garden of Eden as a place of exceptional holiness, and elsewhere in the work it is placed alongside Mount Sinai and Mount Zion within a larger sacred geography. This does not tell us where Eden stood, and it does not prove that the author possessed a map unknown to later generations. It shows instead that an ancient Jewish writer could understand geography through holiness, as well as through rivers, regions, and physical distance. A place could be defined partly by who might enter it, what kind of presence belonged there, and how it related to other sacred locations. That distinction matters because Genesis had already established boundaries around the first human dwelling. The garden could be entered, inhabited, and eventually lost. Access was not permanent. Jubilees develops this inherited landscape in a way that makes its sacred character more explicit. The garden is not simply fertile ground with trees and water. It belongs to an ordered world in which certain locations stand apart from ordinary space. For ancient communities, this way of thinking was not unusual. Temples, mountains, cities, springs, and burial places could possess physical locations while also carrying meanings created through memory, worship, law, and tradition. A mountain remained a mountain, but it could also become a place of encounter. A city remained a settlement, but it could become a center of sacred memory. Eden could remain a garden within a larger landscape while also being understood as a place whose holiness explained why access to it mattered. This helps us return to the question of human beginnings without confusing religious interpretation with biological history. The emergence of Homo sapiens belongs to a far older prehistoric process reconstructed through scientific evidence, while Jubilees belongs to the later history of how people interpreted inherited stories about the first humans. What survives in the Dead Sea Scrolls does not bridge those two histories by preserving an unchanged memory from the biological origin of our species. Instead, it gives us evidence for how ancient Jewish readers organized the meaning of human beginnings. In that interpretive world, losing Eden could mean more than losing fertile land. It could mean separation from a sacred center and a change in the relationship between human beings and a place regarded as set apart. This does not require us to decide whether the author imagined Eden as physically reachable. Sacred geography does not necessarily erase ordinary geography, but it changes the questions asked of it. If Eden is defined partly by holiness and restricted access, then measuring river courses alone will never recover the whole idea. The Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates remain part of the inherited landscape, yet Jubilees shows that another layer had become important in ancient interpretation. Eden could be positioned not only among lands and waters, but among places that structured the sacred world. This is one of the clearest reasons the Dead Sea Scrolls matter to the title's question. They do not reveal that Eden was never a garden, nor do they overturn Genesis. They preserve evidence of a textual culture in which the garden could be understood as one element inside a larger conception of Eden. The familiar image of paradise therefore becomes incomplete, not because a secret geography has been discovered, but because ancient interpretation reminds us that place was also defined by access, holiness, memory, and relationship. Once that layer is restored, the search for Eden begins to shift away from a single missing point on the earth, and toward a quieter question about what kind of place ancient readers believed humanity had lost. If Eden is approached through the Book of Jubilees, one of its most important features is not simply what grows there or which rivers surround it, but who is permitted to be there and what happens when that access changes. This brings us closer to an ancient understanding of sacred space, because sacred places are often distinguished not only by location but by boundaries. A mountain, sanctuary, inner room, or protected garden can occupy ordinary physical ground while still being treated differently from the land around it. Jubilees develops Eden in this direction by presenting the garden as a holy place within a wider sacred geography. And that makes the original human story feel less like life inside an unusually fertile park, and more like life within a space whose meaning depends on a particular relationship between humanity and the divine. Genesis had already prepared this idea. The first humans are placed within the garden, given responsibilities there, and later removed from it. After that removal, the boundary matters, because returning is no longer simply a matter of walking back across the landscape. Access itself has changed. The loss of Eden is therefore spatial in a deeper sense. Human beings do not merely move from one environment to another. They move from a place they could inhabit into a world where that former place is no longer available to them in the same way. Jubilees can be read as intensifying this distinction by treating Eden within a framework of holiness, and that helps explain why later attempts to locate the garden only through rivers may leave something essential out. A modern geographic search asks where the boundary was. Ancient sacred geography could also ask what the boundary meant. These are related questions, but they are not identical. The distinction can be seen in many ancient religious settings where movement toward a sacred center was regulated. Different spaces could carry different degrees of access, and crossing from one into another might depend on status, purity, ritual, or divine permission. We should not force every later temple rule backward into the Eden story, because the texts were produced in different contexts and must be read carefully, but Jubilees itself shows that an ancient Jewish interpreter could connect Eden with a wider pattern of holy places. In that world of thought, space was not neutral. Some locations stood closer to sacred presence than others. This changes the emotional meaning of the first human beginning. The garden is valuable not only because food is abundant there, or because the environment appears peaceful. Its deepest value may lie in a form of access that later humanity no longer possesses. The human loss is therefore not simply environmental. It is relational and spatial at once. The wider earth continues to exist. Rivers continue to flow. Human generations continue beyond the garden. What disappears is unrestricted belonging within that original sacred place. This may help explain why Eden could remain powerful in Jewish imagination even when its physical geography was uncertain. A place can remain culturally important long after its route has become inaccessible or forgotten, especially when the meaning of the place does not depend on ordinary travel. Human communities have repeatedly remembered lost homelands, destroyed sanctuaries, ancestral settlements, and sacred landscapes through stories long after direct access ended. Eden operates on an even more fundamental level, because it is placed at the beginning of human history in the narrative. It becomes a way of thinking about the distance between humanity as it now lives, and an earlier condition imagined as closer to order, abundance, and sacred presence. None of this allows us to claim that Jubilees reveals what prehistoric humans actually experienced. The biological history of our species remains a separate scientific question. What Jubilees preserves is evidence for how ancient people interpreted a story about humanity's beginning. That interpretation shifts attention away from the fantasy of a hidden coordinate and toward the structure of the place itself. Eden has an interior, an exterior, a boundary, and a changing relationship to human beings. Once access becomes part of geography, the question of where Eden stood can no longer be separated from the question of why the place was considered different from the world outside it. The oldest surviving interpretive traditions do not give us the missing road back into Eden. They preserve something more revealing about the ancient imagination. Perhaps the defining feature of Eden was never that it could be found, but that after the human departure, it could no longer be entered in the same way. When the Book of Jubilees places Eden beside Sinai and Zion, it gives a clear sign that ancient Jewish geography could organize the world according to holiness as well as physical distance, because Jubilees describes the Garden of Eden, Mount Sinai, and Mount Zion as holy places standing in a deliberate relationship, and that arrangement changes the way Eden must be read, not by proving that these locations shared one landscape or could be connected on a modern map, but by showing that the author understood certain places as carrying special status within sacred history. Eden belongs to the beginning of humanity, Sinai belongs to the giving of law in Israel's remembered past, and Zion belongs to the religious center associated with Jerusalem. So the three locations come from different moments, yet Jubilees draws them into one conceptual geography, where place is measured not only by terrain but by its relationship to divine presence, memory, and human access. This matters because a modern reader asks how far one place lies from another, and whether archaeology can confirm the route, while an ancient sacred geography could ask which places belong to communal memory, which are treated as set apart, and how movement toward or away from them expresses a relationship between humanity and the sacred. Nothing about this requires us to deny that Sinai and Zion were understood as physical locations, and nothing allows us to claim that Eden has therefore been located beside them. Rather, Jubilees demonstrates that physical and sacred geography could coexist. A mountain could have a real position and also carry meaning beyond elevation. A city could occupy measurable ground while becoming a center of collective memory, and Eden could be described with soil, trees, rivers, and boundaries while also occupying a distinct place in sacred memory. This becomes especially useful when we return to the first human beginning, because Genesis places humanity inside a garden and later outside it, creating a movement from access to exclusion. While Jubilees shows how that original location can be compared conceptually with later holy places without becoming identical to them, the comparison does not prove that Eden was another temple or that Sinai and Zion were copies of the garden, and pushing the evidence that far would turn interpretation into certainty. What the surviving text supports is more restrained. These places are grouped because holiness gives them a relationship that ordinary geographic distance cannot explain, and this helps us understand why the river puzzle alone never fully captures the ancient meaning of Eden. Even if Pishon and Gihon were identified, that information would answer questions about terrain while leaving another ancient question untouched. Why was this beginning place remembered as different from ordinary land? The Dead Sea Scrolls matter here not because they conceal a route back to Eden, but because manuscripts of Jubilees preserve evidence that this sacred reading existed in Jewish thought during the Second Temple period, preserving an ancient interpretation closer to that world. The modern imagination often turns Eden into scenery, while Jubilees places it within an ordered landscape of holiness, where the first human dwelling stands in relationship with later sacred history. This does not erase the geography of Genesis. It adds another dimension. The rivers, named lands, and directions can still matter, but none exists alone. Because for an ancient interpreter, the significance of a place could arise from where it stood in the remembered structure of the world as much as from where it could be reached by walking. And once Eden, Sinai, and Zion are viewed in that way, the mystery becomes less about discovering 3 points on one map, and more about understanding why a tradition about human origins placed Eden within the same sacred imagination that later gathered around mountains, law, sanctuary, and collective memory, and this older framework reminds us that location could carry meaning even when distance remained unresolved. Ancient geography did not always separate physical location from cultural meaning in the way modern maps encourage us to do. A river could be a real waterway and also a boundary between peoples. A mountain could rise from the earth and also become a place remembered for revelation, danger, or covenant. A city could be measured in distance while still carrying meanings that extended far beyond its walls. The Book of Jubilees helps us see Eden within this older way of organizing space. When Eden is placed within a sacred geography alongside places such as Sinai and Zion, the point is not that these locations form a single physical cluster or that one can be reached from another by following a hidden route. The relationship is conceptual as well as spatial. Each place occupies a position within a larger memory of beginnings, encounter, law, and holiness. This helps explain why a search for Eden based only on rivers may remain incomplete even if every river name could one day be identified. Geography in the ancient world could tell people where they were, but it could also tell them what kind of place they were standing in. Some spaces were ordinary. Others were associated with ancestors, divine presence, burial, law, kingship, or communal identity. The difference between one place and another was therefore not only distance, it could also be access, status, memory, and the events believed to have occurred there. This way of thinking is especially important for the Eden story because the first human dwelling is defined by more than vegetation. The garden has an interior and an exterior. Human beings are placed within it, and later removed from it. The landscape therefore carries a human condition. To be inside is not the same as being outside, and the change between those states becomes part of the story of human beginnings. Jubilees develops this pattern by treating Eden within a broader sacred order. That does not mean the author was uninterested in real geography. Ancient sacred geography often depended precisely on real places. Zion was not meaningful because it was imaginary, and Sinai was not meaningful only because it symbolized something. Their physical reality and their sacred significance could exist together. Eden may have been understood in the same layered way. A place could be described through land, water, and direction, while also functioning as a center of memory that ordinary travel could not fully explain. This distinction protects us from another common mistake, assuming that if a place has symbolic meaning, it cannot have had any geographic meaning at all. Ancient texts do not force that choice. They can preserve a place as both landscape and idea. For the history of human origins, this matters because later communities often understood themselves through places they believed stood near the beginning of their story. Those places helped organize identity across generations. A homeland, sanctuary, mountain, or lost garden could become a point around which questions of belonging were arranged. Eden functions at the deepest level of that pattern. It is connected to the first humans, to the beginning of cultivated life in the narrative, to water, to boundaries, and eventually to exclusion. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not prove that this geography can be reconstructed physically, but texts preserved in their wider literary world show that ancient readers were comfortable giving places more than one kind of meaning at the same time. This is why the geography of Eden should not be reduced either to a modern map or to pure metaphor. Both reductions remove something the ancient text allows us to keep. The physical features matter because they locate the story within a recognizable world of rivers and lands. The sacred features matter because they explain why location alone was never the whole question. Eden was not important simply because it was somewhere. It was important because of what kind of somewhere it was, how human beings related to it, and what changed when that relationship was lost. Once Eden is understood as part of a sacred geography, the landscape begins to carry more than one kind of meaning at the same time. Trees, water, soil, direction, and boundaries still matter, because the story is not detached from the physical world. Yet the place also becomes a way of organizing memory, access, and human relationship to what is considered holy. This is where the Book of Jubilees becomes especially useful. It does not erase the rivers of Genesis or replace them with a purely symbolic Eden. Instead, it shows that an ancient Jewish interpreter could take the inherited geography seriously, while also placing Eden within a wider order of sacred places. That combination suggests that the question, "Where was Eden?" may be too narrow if it is asked only in modern geographic terms. A modern search tends to imagine that a place becomes real only when it can be fixed to coordinates, traced through drainage systems, or identified by archaeology. Ancient readers could recognize a place in another way. They could understand its importance through what happened there, who belonged there, who could enter it, and how it stood in relation to other remembered places. Eden fits naturally within that pattern. The garden is described through physical features, but its significance grows from the condition of life inside it, and from the change that occurs when human beings are excluded from it. The boundary is therefore not just a fence between two kinds of terrain. It marks a difference in human condition. Inside the garden, the first humans occupy a place prepared for them. Outside it, human life continues under different conditions. Later Jewish interpretation could deepen that distinction by treating Eden as a holy place rather than simply a fertile one. This does not mean we should claim that the author of Jubilees knew the physical location of Eden, or that the text preserves a lost map. Nothing in the surviving evidence allows that conclusion. What it preserves is a different understanding of what geography itself could mean. A place could be both physical and sacred without one meaning canceling the other. That is important for the broader history of human thought, because people have often used landscapes to organize ideas about origin, belonging, separation, and memory. Long before modern geography divided the Earth into standardized coordinates and political borders, communities understood space through routes, rivers, mountains, ancestral lands, shrines, and places associated with major events. The environment was not simply around human history. It helped give history its shape. Eden stands at the beginning of this pattern in the biblical narrative. Human life begins in a particular place. Movement outward changes the human situation, and the memory of that first place remains even though ordinary access is lost. This is also why the Dead Sea Scrolls matter without giving us a sensational discovery. They preserve evidence of a world in which ancient readers continued to think about the earliest biblical stories and to place them within wider systems of meaning. Jubilees shows that Eden could be read as part of such a system. The result does not solve the geographic puzzle of Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. It changes the scale of the puzzle. Even if every river were securely identified, a physical map alone would still not explain why Eden was remembered as distinct from ordinary land. Its importance came from more than vegetation and water. It came from the relationship between humans and the place itself, from the boundary between access and exclusion, and from the way later communities linked that beginning with other sacred locations. Seen in this light, Eden is not less geographic. It is more than landscape. The geography carries the memory of a human beginning that ancient readers understood through both the earth beneath their feet and the sacred order they believed gave that earth meaning. The unanswered question is therefore not merely which land once matched the description, but why the first human home had to be imagined as a place whose meaning exceeded its visible terrain. Direction begins to matter in the Eden narrative long before anyone attempts to place the garden on a modern map. Because Genesis does not describe the first human dwelling as an undefined paradise floating outside ordinary space, it gives the landscape orientation, placing the garden in Eden toward the east and later describing the human beings as being driven out while protection is established on the eastern side of the garden. And these directional details create a quiet pattern that becomes more meaningful when we stop treating east as merely a compass point and begin asking what direction does inside the story, because the first human home has an inside and an outside. Movement occurs across a boundary, and after that movement the route back is no longer open in the same way, which means geography is carrying the consequences of the human condition as well as describing terrain. Yet we should be careful not to turn this into a universal rule that east always meant exile or separation in every ancient text, since directions could have different meanings depending on context. What matters here is the pattern within the narrative itself. The garden is placed in a particular direction within Eden, and after the loss of access, the eastern boundary becomes significant again, creating a spatial memory that later readers could recognize even without knowing where Eden physically stood. And this is especially important for the larger question of human beginnings, because the story does not imagine humanity beginning everywhere at once. It begins with placement. A human being is put somewhere, surrounded by a particular environment, given access to some things and limits around others, then eventually moved from that place into a wider world. So the geography of Eden becomes inseparable from the transition between an original dwelling and ordinary human existence. A transition that is remembered through movement rather than through a scientific account of biological origins, since the emergence of Homo sapiens belongs to a much older African prehistory reconstructed through fossils, genetics, archaeology, and environmental evidence, while the Eden narrative belongs to the later history of how ancient communities thought about why human life feels separated from an ideal beginning. And once these two kinds of explanation are kept distinct, the directional language becomes easier to understand without asking it to prove something it cannot prove. East does not reveal where the first members of our species lived, but within the literary geography, it helps establish relationship, distance, and lost access. And this same concern with orientation appears in many ancient cultures where direction could organize settlements, routes, sacred places, entrances, and remembered territories, not because every direction carried one fixed meaning, but because human beings experience the world spatially. We know places partly by how we approach them, leave them, face them, and travel between them, and a story about origins naturally draws on that embodied way of knowing, which may be one reason the Eden account continues to feel geographic, even when its map cannot be recovered, because it does not merely name land, it describes movement through land, and movement gives the landscape emotional and historical structure. The human beings do not simply lose a condition, they leave a place, and once outside, the place behind them becomes inaccessible. So the distance between humanity and Eden is expressed physically, even before later interpretation develops the garden into a more explicit sacred space. And the Book of Jubilees can then build upon that older pattern by treating Eden as a holy location within a broader sacred geography, showing that later ancient readers could understand directional and spatial distinctions as part of a larger order without possessing a modern coordinate system. This makes the Eastern orientation more useful as evidence of how the story works than as evidence for where the garden stood, because attempts to use East as a navigation instruction quickly encounter the same problem as the rivers. There is no secure starting point, no measured distance, and no complete sequence of landmarks. So the direction cannot lead a modern traveler to Eden, but it can tell us that ancient listeners were meant to imagine the beginning of human life in spatial terms, with a center, a boundary, a movement outward, and a world beyond. And that subtle shift prepares us for the deeper meaning of exile, because once direction has been established, leaving Eden is no longer simply the disappearance of paradise from the story. It becomes a human movement away from a place that remains behind, remembered but no longer entered as before. Once the human beings leave the garden, Eden changes from a place of residence into a place of memory, and that transformation is one of the most important geographic movements in the entire narrative. Because, before the departure, the garden is simply where human life takes place, while afterward it becomes a location defined by absence, separation, and the impossibility of returning in the same way. So the meaning of the landscape changes without the landscape itself needing to disappear. And this distinction helps explain why Eden remained so powerful in later interpretation, since a place that can no longer be entered may become more important in memory than a place that remains available, especially when it is connected with the imagined beginning of human history. And Genesis expresses that loss through movement. The humans are no longer where they were. The boundary is now between them and the garden. And ordinary life continues outside, where cultivation, birth, conflict, settlement, and generations unfold, meaning that the wider human world begins after a geographic separation. Not because Genesis is providing a scientific account of migration or the biological expansion of Homo sapiens, but because the story uses space to explain a change in human condition. And this is where the difference between sacred narrative and prehistoric reconstruction must remain clear. The deep population history of our species is studied through fossils, genetics, archaeology, and changing environments, while the movement out of Eden belongs to an ancient literary tradition, reflecting on why human beings experience labor, mortality, distance, and limits. Yet, even within that literary framework, the geography matters. because the human beings are not simply told that something has changed inside them. They are placed somewhere else, and that physical displacement gives the loss of form that can be imagined. A person can understand what it means to leave a home, cross a boundary, or look back toward a place that is no longer accessible. And ancient communities throughout history experience movement through migration, warfare, changing settlements, political displacement, and the loss of ancestral places. So, a story in which human existence begins with departure from a protected place could speak through a deeply recognizable spatial experience without needing to record one specific historical exile. And later, Jewish readers living in worlds shaped by remembered displacement may have found even more meaning in such geography. Although we should not assume that every interpretation of Eden arose from the same historical experience, because traditions can accumulate meanings across centuries, the important point is that exile changes how a place functions in memory. Once Eden is behind humanity, its value is no longer measured only by what grew there. The rivers, trees, and fertile ground remain important, but the defining fact becomes that the humans are outside, and this is precisely why the Book of Jubilees can later develop Eden as sacred space without needing to identify its coordinates, since holiness and restricted access reinforce a pattern already present in Genesis. A place once inhabited becomes a place set apart, and the distance between humanity and that place becomes part of the story itself. So when modern readers ask where Eden was, they may be asking only half of the geographic question, because the ancient narrative is equally concerned with where humans are in relation to Eden after leaving it. And the answer is not expressed through kilometers or borders, but through exclusion. The first human home remains conceptually behind them while human history proceeds elsewhere, which means the story of beginnings quickly becomes a story about living away from the beginning, and perhaps that is why the geography continues to matter, even after its exact location becomes impossible to recover. Because Eden is transformed from somewhere humans inhabit into somewhere humans remember. And from that moment onward, the central geographic fact is no longer simply the garden itself, but the distance that now exists between humanity and the place where its story began. The boundary at Eden is important because it turns the story of human beginnings into a story about separation, and once that boundary appears, geography begins to carry a meaning that reaches beyond simple location, because the first humans are no longer defined only by where they live, but also by where they are no longer able to live. And this creates one of the earliest spatial divisions in the narrative, an inside associated with the garden and an outside where ordinary human history continues. Yet the boundary should not be imagined too quickly as a wall, gate, or physical structure in the modern sense. Since Genesis is more concerned with access than architecture, the important fact is that the humans cannot simply return to the former condition by reversing their steps. And this makes the separation different from an ordinary journey, because traveling away from a place normally leaves open the possibility of traveling back, while the Eden account describes a change in which the relationship between humans and the original place has been altered. And this difference helps explain why later Jewish interpretation could understand Eden as sacred space, since sacred spaces are often defined partly through limits, distinctions, and regulated access. Although we should avoid reading every later religious practice back into Genesis, the basic spatial pattern is already present there. A place is set apart. Humans once inhabit it, they leave it, and afterward the boundary between them and that place becomes meaningful. And for the history of human thought, this is a powerful way of describing loss, because human beings understand absence through space as naturally as through time. We remember a home by knowing that we are no longer inside it. We understand exile through the distance between where we are and where we belonged. And we understand boundaries through the simple experience that one side can be reached while another cannot. So, the Eden story uses an ordinary human experience of space to describe something much larger about the human condition. And this connection becomes especially important when we think about origins, because the biological history of Homo sapiens does not contain evidence of one moment when all humans were expelled from a single garden, and modern science reconstructs our species through long processes of population change, movement, adaptation, and interaction across prehistoric environments. But the Eden tradition asks a different kind of question. It imagines why human life feels distant from an ideal beginning, and it gives that distance a geographic form, with humanity living outside a place associated with the beginning. And this means the boundary becomes part of the memory of origin itself, not simply the end of the garden episode. From that point forward, human generations unfold beyond Eden. Places are settled, families expand, landscapes change, and history continues in the wider world, while the original place remains behind as a reference point that cannot be approached in the same way. And this is why the boundary may matter more than any proposed coordinate, because a coordinate would tell us where a place stood, while a boundary tells us how humans are related to it, and the ancient text seems deeply interested in that relationship. The river system connects Eden outward to other lands, but the human movement is in the opposite direction, away from the protected center and into ordinary space, creating a contrast between water that continues to flow and humans who cannot return. And this quiet contrast gives the geography unusual force, because the landscape remains connected while access does not. The world beyond Eden is not cut off from the same earth, water, soil, and life. Yet something about the human relationship to the beginning has changed, and later traditions such as Jubilees can intensify this by treating Eden within a sacred geography, where holiness helps explain why some spaces are different from others. But even without those later interpretations, Genesis already presents the first human boundary as more than a line on the ground. It is the point at which the story of humanity becomes the story of living elsewhere. And once that shift occurs, Eden can be remembered without being recoverable, imagined without being physically entered, and connected to the wider world without becoming an ordinary destination, which may be why every attempt to locate Eden geographically eventually encounters the deeper problem that the text itself seems more concerned with the loss of access than with giving directions back, leaving us with a boundary that is clearer in meaning than in location, and with a human beginning defined not only by where life is first placed, but by the enduring distance between that beginning and the world in which later generations must live. The desire to locate Eden on a modern map is understandable, because a coordinate seems to promise something that an ancient story cannot easily provide: a fixed point where uncertainty ends, where the rivers finally align, and where the beginning of human life can be imagined as a place that could still be reached, photographed, excavated, or named. Yet this desire may tell us as much about modern expectations as it does about the ancient text, because Genesis never gives the kind of geographic instructions required for such a search. It names rivers and lands, establishes direction and movement, and places the garden within Eden, but it does not provide measured distances, a route from a known city, or any unmistakable landmark from which the entire landscape can be reconstructed. And once the unidentified Pishon and Gihon are added to the problem, every proposed location requires assumptions that go beyond what the text securely preserves. Nevertheless, the attraction remains powerful, because human beings often want beginnings to have a center, a single place that can turn a difficult question into something visible. And the Eden story seems to invite this instinct by combining an origin narrative with recognizable geographic language, especially the Tigris and Euphrates, which still belong to the physical world. So the moment those names are recognized, the mind naturally begins searching nearby for the missing garden. Yet two identifiable rivers do not transform the entire description into a recoverable map. And the history of human origins makes this limitation even more important, because scientific evidence does not describe Homo sapiens as appearing suddenly at one historical location between known rivers. Rather, our species emerged through deep population histories in Africa involving communities spread across changing environments over long periods. So, even if an ancient landscape associated with Eden could someday be identified more convincingly, it would not become the biological birthplace of humanity in the scientific sense. The two questions belong to different forms of knowledge, one concerning the evolution and dispersal of our species, and the other concerning how ancient communities imagined the meaning of human beginnings. And confusing them creates the illusion that finding a garden would solve a question the biblical story was never equipped to answer. The same caution applies to archaeology, because discovering an ancient settlement, river channel, fertile basin, or region with valuable resources near Mesopotamia does not establish that the place was Eden unless independent evidence connects it specifically with that tradition, and no such identification has achieved broad scholarly acceptance, which means the honest investigation must allow the coordinate to remain missing, not because geography is irrelevant, but because geography in the story may have been doing more than pointing toward a destination. The previous clues have shown a garden located within a larger Eden, water connecting that center with distant lands, boundaries distinguishing access from exclusion, and later interpretations such as Jubilees treating Eden within a sacred geography, all of which suggest that place mattered deeply while also serving functions that a modern atlas cannot capture. So the persistent search for one lost coordinate may be asking ancient geography to behave like a technology of measurement rather than a language of relationship, memory, and meaning. And this difference becomes especially clear when Eden is considered after the human departure, because the story does not describe later generations organizing an expedition back to the garden or preserving a route by which it might be rediscovered. Instead, the place becomes increasingly defined by distance and lost access, leaving humanity to inhabit the wider world while remembering a beginning that remains behind. And perhaps this is why the idea of finding Eden continues to fascinate modern readers, because a coordinate would seem to reverse that loss, turning an inaccessible beginning into a destination once again. But the surviving evidence does not give us permission to make that reversal. It asks us instead to live with a more difficult possibility, that Eden may remain geographically meaningful without ever becoming geographically recoverable. There is a point in every attempt to locate Eden where geography stops being evidence and begins to become speculation. And that point is not always easy to notice because the transition can happen gradually, one reasonable assumption at a time, first by identifying the Tigris and Euphrates, then by proposing a location for Havilah, then by matching a dry channel with the Pishon, then by assigning another river to the Gihon, and finally by adjusting ancient coastlines or river courses until the entire landscape appears to fit. And each individual step may sound possible, yet possibility is not the same as confirmation, especially when several uncertain steps depend on one another. Because the more assumptions a reconstruction requires, the less secure the final picture becomes. And this is why the Eden question demands unusually careful separation between what the text actually says and what later interpreters add to it. Genesis clearly names 4 rivers, clearly associates some of them with named lands, and clearly connects the garden with a wider Eden landscape. But it does not tell us which modern waterways correspond to Pishon and Gihon. It does not provide coordinates, and it does not explain how the complete river system should be understood in relation to the physical geography known today. So any attempt to move beyond those limits must be labeled as a hypothesis rather than a discovery. And the same principle applies when geology is brought into the discussion, because ancient river channels can sometimes be reconstructed through sediments, satellite imagery, geomorphology, and other forms of evidence. But finding a former river course does not establish that the ancient writers knew that channel as the Pishon or Gihon, nor does a changed coastline prove that Eden once occupied a particular basin. These findings can make a proposal more plausible, but they cannot carry the identification by themselves. And archaeology faces the same boundary: an ancient settlement, irrigation system, fertile plain, or early agricultural landscape may help us understand the environments in which people lived, yet unless there is independent evidence connecting such a site specifically with the Eden tradition, it cannot honestly be called the garden described in Genesis. And this distinction matters deeply when the story is connected with human origins, because the biological history of Homo sapiens is reconstructed through evidence far older than the biblical texts, and does not point to one historical garden as the birthplace of the species, while Eden belongs to the later cultural history of how communities imagined the beginning of human life, dependence, loss, and belonging. So when a modern theory claims to have found both the garden and the origin point of humanity, it is often combining two separate questions into one conclusion that neither field of evidence supports. And the Dead Sea Scrolls do not remove this problem. They provide older textual witnesses and preserve works such as Jubilees that help us understand how ancient Jewish readers interpreted Eden. but they do not supply the missing geographic key, which means that the most responsible use of the scrolls is to clarify how Eden was understood, rather than to use their antiquity as proof that a modern location theory must be correct. This is where the investigation becomes more useful for the listener, because learning to distinguish evidence from interpretation is part of understanding history itself. Every ancient text reaches us through incomplete preservation, translation, damaged manuscripts, changing place names, and later interpretation, and historical work becomes reliable not when uncertainty disappears, but when uncertainty is made visible. So the geography of Eden should be approached in layers, with river names treated as textual evidence, proposed identifications treated according to their strength, geological reconstructions treated as environmental evidence, and sacred interpretations treated as evidence for ancient thought, without allowing one category to silently become another. And once those boundaries are kept clear, the search for Eden becomes less sensational, but far more meaningful. Because instead of pretending that one theory has solved the ancient map, we can see exactly where knowledge ends, where interpretation begins, and why the unanswered space between them has survived for so long. After following the rivers, the place names, the manuscript evidence, and the later interpretations, a different possibility begins to emerge. Perhaps the difficulty is not only that Eden is hard to locate, but that modern readers may be asking the ancient text a question it was never designed to answer in the form we expect. Because, where was Eden? Sounds simple, only if we assume that the purpose of the description was to preserve a recoverable coordinate, yet Genesis does not behave like a survey, a travel itinerary, or a boundary document. It gives enough geography to place the story within a meaningful world, but not enough to reconstruct that world with modern precision. And the Dead Sea Scrolls do not repair this absence. They take us closer to the ancient history of the texts and interpretations, while works such as Jubilees reveal that Eden could be understood through sacred space, access, holiness, and relationship, as well as through rivers and lands, which means the ancient question may have been larger than location from the beginning. Perhaps the geography was helping readers understand what kind of place the first human dwelling was, how it related to the world outside it, and why leaving it changed the condition of human life. And if that is true, then insisting on one modern coordinate can narrow the story rather than clarify it, because a coordinate answers only where a point stands on the earth, while the Eden narrative repeatedly asks us to notice relationships. A garden inside a larger Eden, water flowing outward, named lands connected to rivers, an interior and exterior, access and exclusion, movement away from a protected center, and later traditions that place Eden among spaces treated as holy. None of these elements proves that Eden was purely symbolic, and there is no need to erase its geographic dimension, but they suggest that geography was carrying meaning that cannot be reduced to distance alone. And this becomes especially important when the story is placed beside the scientific history of human origins, because Homo sapiens emerged through deep evolutionary and population processes in Africa long before the composition of Genesis, so the biblical Eden cannot responsibly be presented as the scientifically identified birthplace of our species. Yet that does not make the narrative irrelevant to the human past. It belongs to another layer of history. The history of how people thought about beginnings, belonging, dependence, loss, and the relationship between human beings and the environments they inhabited. And from that perspective, Eden becomes evidence not for a prehistoric coordinate, but for an ancient way of organizing the human condition through landscape, which may explain why the story gives us enough physical detail to feel grounded while withholding the precision required for recovery, because the place must be imagined as connected with the known world, but its meaning does not depend on becoming an ordinary destination. And this may also explain why later readers could continue developing Eden even when its location remained uncertain. Sacred memory can survive without a road, and a place can remain central to identity long after access has disappeared, just as lost cities, abandoned homelands, destroyed sanctuaries, and ancestral territories can continue shaping communities through memory, except that Eden is placed even deeper in the narrative, before ordinary human history unfolds. So its distance becomes a way of expressing the distance between present human existence and an imagined beginning. And once this is recognized, the river problem changes character. The unresolved Pishon and Gihon are no longer merely failures preventing us from completing a map. They become reminders that the surviving geography is partial, while the Tigris and Euphrates show that the story still reaches toward recognizable terrain, creating a balance between familiarity and distance. And the Dead Sea Scrolls strengthen this conclusion not by revealing a hidden answer, but by showing that ancient Jewish readers continued to interpret these beginnings within a world where sacred and physical geography could overlap. So, perhaps the better question is not which modern country contains Eden, but how did ancient readers understand the place that stood at the beginning of human life? And why was it remembered through rivers, boundaries, holiness, and lost access? That question does not eliminate the geographic search, but it places it inside a larger historical framework, where evidence can remain evidence, interpretation can remain interpretation, and uncertainty does not need to be hidden. And this may be the most important correction before the final pieces are assembled, because once the question changes, Eden no longer has to be reduced either to a literal point that someone must eventually discover, or to a symbol detached from the earth. It can remain what the surviving traditions allow us to see, a remembered place at the intersection of landscape, sacred meaning, and human origin. A place whose exact coordinates remain unresolved while its role in ancient thought becomes increasingly clear. When the clues are placed beside one another, Eden begins to look less like a single lost garden waiting to be discovered and more like a layered ancient landscape whose meaning was preserved through several kinds of memory at once. Genesis distinguishes the garden from Eden itself, describing a garden planted within a larger setting, then connects that setting with flowing water, named rivers, distant lands, direction, movement, and eventually a boundary that human beings can no longer cross in the same way. These details keep the story rooted in geography, yet they never provide the measured distances or fixed coordinates required for a modern map. And that tension remains important because it prevents us from choosing too quickly between two simple answers. Eden does not have to be treated as a purely symbolic place with no relation to geography, but neither can it be presented as a location that has been scientifically or archaeologically identified. The Tigris and Euphrates give the narrative recognizable anchors in the ancient Near Eastern world, while the Pishon and Gihon remain uncertain. Havilah and Cush add further geographic texture without giving us secure modern boundaries, and the resulting river system resists every attempt to turn the account into one neat physical diagram. This does not mean the geography has failed. It means the geography may have been doing more than one thing. Ancient people could use rivers and lands to describe real environments while also allowing those places to carry memory, identity, sacred meaning, and relationships between center and distance. And this becomes clear when the Dead Sea Scrolls are brought into the discussion. Because the scrolls do not reveal a hidden map of Eden, they preserve a much earlier textual world in which Genesis was copied, and in which other Jewish writings interpreted the beginnings of humanity. The Book of Jubilees is especially important because it treats Eden within a broader sacred geography, placing the Garden of Eden in relationship with places such as Sinai and Zion. Not to say that these locations were physically adjacent, but to show that sacred status could organize space as strongly as distance or terrain. And once this ancient way of thinking is recognized, the human departure from Eden takes on a deeper geographic meaning. The loss is not simply the disappearance of pleasant scenery. It is the loss of access to a place that had become distinct from the world outside it. Humanity continues to live on the same earth, under the same sky, among rivers, soils, animals, seasons, and changing landscapes. Yet the first dwelling remains behind as a remembered center that cannot be entered as before, and this is where the history of human origins must be kept clear. The biological emergence of Homo sapiens belongs to a far older African prehistory reconstructed through fossils, genetics, archaeology, and ancient environments, while Eden belongs to the later history of how human communities explain beginnings through story, place, loss, and belonging. These two histories should not be collapsed into one another, because doing so would ask an ancient sacred narrative to function as evolutionary science. and it would also weaken the real historical value of the text, which lies in showing how ancient people used landscape to think about what it meant to be human. So when all the clues are reassembled, the strongest conclusion is not that one river theory has won, or that one modern country can claim Eden, or that the Dead Sea Scrolls contain information later traditions concealed. The stronger conclusion is that Eden was remembered through a geography that was at once physical enough to name rivers and lands, structured enough to contain an inside and an outside, and sacred enough for later interpreters to place it within a wider order of holy spaces. And that combination helps explain why the story has resisted every attempt to reduce it to either a map or a metaphor. Because the ancient landscape carries both place and meaning. And the final question is, therefore, no longer whether one clue can solve Eden, but what happens when all of them are allowed to remain together without forcing certainty where the evidence has preserved only relationship. After following the evidence as far as it can reasonably take us, there are several things we can say with confidence, and several things we should leave unresolved, because the value of the Eden question does not depend on pretending that every uncertainty has disappeared. We can say that Genesis does not simply describe Eden and the garden as if they were obviously identical. The wording presents a garden planted within Eden, which suggests a larger setting surrounding the first human dwelling. We can say that water is central to that landscape, with one river associated with Eden before the text introduces 4 named rivers connected with wider lands. We can identify the Tigris and Euphrates with confidence, while the Pishon and Gihon remain uncertain, and Havilah and Cush cannot be used as fixed modern coordinates without making assumptions that the surviving evidence does not justify. We can also say that the complete river system does not correspond neatly to the physical arrangement seen on modern maps. Ancient waterways have certainly changed over time, but the fact that rivers can move does not prove that one particular reconstructed landscape was Eden. Geological possibility is not the same as historical identification. The same rule applies to archaeology. A fertile, ancient basin, a vanished river channel, or an early settlement may teach us a great deal about how people once lived, but none becomes the Garden of Eden simply because it resembles part of the description. No archaeological discovery has produced evidence broadly accepted as identifying Eden itself. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not change that conclusion. Their importance is immense, but it lies in the history of text and interpretation, rather than in the recovery of a hidden geographic key. They preserve ancient manuscripts of biblical writings and other Jewish works from the Second Temple period, allowing us to see that stories about creation and human beginnings existed within a rich literary environment. They do not contain a secret map showing where Eden stood, and they do not reveal that later biblical traditions removed such a map. What they do preserve includes works such as the Book of Jubilees, which demonstrates that ancient readers could interpret Eden as part of a wider sacred geography. In Jubilees, the Garden of Eden is treated alongside other holy places, helping us see that ancient geography could involve more than terrain. A place could be physical and sacred at the same time. It could be defined by water and soil, but also by memory, holiness, boundaries, and access. This does not allow us to claim that Eden was only symbolic. Genesis uses real geographic language, and some of its names belong clearly to the ancient Near Eastern world. But neither does it allow us to claim that the story is a prehistoric scientific report. The biological origins of Homo sapiens belong to a far deeper past, and are reconstructed through fossils, genetics, archaeology, and the study of ancient environments, with the strongest scientific evidence placing the emergence of our species within Africa over a long evolutionary history. Eden belongs to another historical layer, the record of how ancient communities thought about human beginnings and expressed those questions through landscape. Keeping these layers separate is not a weakness. It is what allows both forms of evidence to remain useful. Science can tell us about population history, evolution, migration, and changing environments. Ancient texts can tell us how later human communities tried to understand dependence, mortality, belonging, boundaries, and the sense that something valuable lay behind the conditions of ordinary life. The Eden narrative turns those questions into geography. Humanity begins somewhere, water sustains that place, lands extend beyond it, a boundary appears, and human life continues outside. Later interpretation can deepen that geography without turning it into a modern map. This is perhaps the most responsible conclusion available to us. We do not know where Eden was, and we do not know whether the author expected readers to imagine one recoverable physical location corresponding exactly to the description. We do know that ancient readers took the place seriously enough to preserve, copy, and reinterpret it across generations. We know that Eden functioned as more than scenery. It stood at the meeting point between land and memory, between human beginnings and human separation, between a physical world of rivers and a sacred world of restricted access. The evidence does not permit the certainty that a sensational claim might offer, but it gives us something more durable. A clearer view of how people in the ancient world used geography to think about what it meant to be human, and why the place they imagined at the beginning could remain meaningful even when its exact location could no longer be recovered. Perhaps the most useful way to end the search for Eden is not by drawing one final circle on a map, but by noticing the kind of map that has been handed down to us, because the surviving tradition is made from several layers that do not fit neatly into a single modern category. Genesis gives us a garden within Eden, a river flowing outward, four named waterways, surrounding lands, an eastern orientation, and a boundary that eventually separates humanity from the place where its story begins. While the Dead Sea Scrolls bring us closer to the ancient textual world in which these traditions were copied and interpreted, and the Book of Jubilees shows that Eden could also be understood as sacred space, related not merely to terrain but to holiness, memory, and access. And when these layers are placed together honestly, the picture that remains is neither a secret geographic code nor a meaningless legend floating free from the earth. It is an ancient attempt to think about human beginnings through landscape, and that may be why the story has remained so difficult to reduce to one explanation. Because landscapes themselves carry more than one kind of information. They tell us where water flows and where soil changes. But they also become places where generations remember arrival, departure, safety, loss, and belonging. And human societies have done this repeatedly across history, giving mountains, rivers, valleys, cities, and ancestral territories meanings that cannot be measured only by distance. So Eden belongs to a long human habit of placing memory into geography, even though its position at the beginning of the biblical narrative gives it an unusual depth, since the first human home is imagined not simply as somewhere people once lived, but as somewhere later humanity no longer inhabits. And that difference turns geography into memory. A place becomes more powerful precisely because it cannot be returned to in the ordinary way. And the value of this idea does not depend on proving that the landscape corresponds exactly to one region in Mesopotamia or elsewhere, because the historical lesson lies partly in understanding the limits of our evidence. The Tigris and Euphrates can be identified, the Pishon and Gihon cannot be identified with comparable confidence. Havilah and Cush remain difficult to map precisely. River courses may have changed, ancient names may have shifted, and no archaeological discovery has established a site that can responsibly be called Eden, while the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve no missing set of coordinates capable of resolving those problems. So intellectual honesty requires us to stop before possibility becomes fact, and that restraint itself has value, especially in a time when ancient mysteries are often presented as though uncertainty were something embarrassing that must be replaced by a dramatic answer. Because history works differently, sometimes the most accurate conclusion is that several pieces survive while the connection between them remains incomplete. And learning to live with that incompleteness can teach us more about the past than forcing the evidence into a shape it does not support. The same care matters when we connect Eden with the origins of humanity, since the biological history of Homo sapiens reaches far deeper into the past than any surviving biblical manuscript, and is reconstructed through scientific evidence pointing to a long African evolutionary history, while Eden belongs to the history of human thought, to the way later communities asked why life contains work, limits, separation, mortality, and the memory of a condition imagined as different from the present. These are not competing answers to the same scientific question. They are different kinds of evidence addressing different layers of the human experience, and allowing them to remain distinct protects both from being distorted Because science does not need Eden to explain how our species emerged, and the Eden tradition does not need to become a prehistoric field report in order to reveal something important about how human beings have understood themselves. Perhaps this is the quieter value left by the geography clues. They show us that ancient people placed the beginning of humanity within relationships between water and land, inside and outside, center and distance, access and loss. And later interpreters continued to deepen those relationships rather than replacing them with a simple route back. So the map we inherit is not one that tells us where to dig. It is one that shows how people once arranged the world around a remembered beginning. And the educational value of reading it carefully is learning to distinguish evidence from interpretation, possibility from proof, and ancient meaning from modern expectation, while still allowing uncertainty to remain meaningful. Because not every unanswered question is a failure of knowledge. Sometimes it marks the exact boundary where knowledge must stop and thoughtful interpretation can begin. And after the rivers, the manuscripts, the sacred geography, and the long history of human attempts to remember where they came from, one question can remain open without needing to be solved. If Eden was remembered not merely as a garden, but as a place where geography, sacred meaning, human belonging, and lost access all met, then what exactly were ancient people trying to preserve when they preserved the memory of Eden?